Yeah, so I'm really excited to present this paper. I will say it's been one of the most interesting papers in my career to write, because I've never had a paper that became such a politically hot topic in the midst of writing it. So this has been really fascinating in that as we've had this work in progress, we've been receiving a lot of questions from journalists, from politicians, from some State Department officials. So that's all been very intriguing and has actually helped us think a lot more clearly about some of these issues. Also, I want to say that I do have these fantastic co-authors. It's political economists, trade economists, a political scientist, all working together, and that's been a lot of fun too. So, and as Brian said, Jaya and Sungju are online. Abehi, I think, is traveling. Yeah. So the main motivation here was, and it looks like my collection is a little bit unstable, but I'll just monitor that real quick. Can you all still hear me all right? Yeah. The main motivation here was we had been observing the 2018 Trump tariffs. And I think one thing that's important to know is that the Biden administration had kept these tariffs pretty much in place. In fact, had even tightened them up a little bit by reducing some of the exemptions that were granted. And from the Vietnam side, I think some of the Vietnamese scholars online know there had been a tremendous surge of investment into Vietnam over this period, leading to a large amount of exports to the US. And um, I um, I think all of us knew that a lot of this production was what we call in the paper value-added production, or what was companies moving actually productive processes into Vietnam, importing goods from China, but doing most of the production or assembly in Vietnam. But alongside this came something that we call rerouting, which was product moving into Vietnam, essentially putting a made in Vietnam sticker on it and then being exported. What was happening in the policy debate in DC that started to concern us was that all these two different activities were being conflated. That policymakers were saying, look, Vietnam's importing so much more from China, um, and it's exporting so much more to the US. All of that must be rerouting. And so our sort of thinking about this went into hyperdrive with the new Trump administration because we had an inkling that they were very focused on trade deficits and they might use this sudden surge in exports from Vietnam as a way to take on across the board penalties. And so our goal in the paper was to see what we could do to provide better measurement to this important policy debate, and hopefully along the way something what we thought very theoretically interesting about global supply chains. So the big questions that motivate us were Chinese products being and how what was the extent of that? And and I'll talk in a second. There are different ways of approaching this. Previous in the literature, we wanted to do something a little bit different. We wanted to know which firms were doing the rerouting if it was taking place, and then an important, really important question for us. And I think that one of the things I really want to focus on in this paper was what was the impact on Vietnam, both from what we call the value-added production and from the rerouting activity. Was this good for Vietnam? Was this leading to new jobs, new tax revenue? And how do we think about that issue? Okay. All right. So let's just like get a few little sort of just facts clear. And I do think I think one of the questions that will definitely come up is like, is the analysis that we're doing relevant today? And I think my co-authors and I would absolutely agree that it absolutely is completely relevant. And this gives us a way to understand this a little bit better. But you can see here the tariff, the trade war started off in early 2018. There was some issues here about currency manipulation and accusations in the US, and then some questions about solar panels. But then it kicked into high gear with a series of sort of increasingly incremental increases of both countries in the tariff rate. And then you can see it's steadied out here, heading into the Biden administration with almost an across the board tariff on the US of about 20%, affecting about $350 billion of imports from China. China had its own retaliation, which we have to take into account in our analysis, but we're really thinking about these products here that were receiving these high tariff rates. And I should say it was one of the complications in this analysis is one of the easy things to think about in this analysis would be to say, well, the counterfactual is the products that were not tariffed. But in fact, most of the goods end up being tariffed to some degree. And so we have to get our counterfactual in some other ways. For example, by comparing products from China to products from other countries. Okay, so we're not the only people working on this, and there's a really important and influential paper by Laurel Alfaro and Davin Chor that has tried to study this on a global scale. And I want to highlight this because they one of the reasons why Vietnam is such an important country to study, not just because I've worked in Vietnam for a long time, but because you can see here that Vietnam is the country that takes up the largest share of replacement of Chinese exports to the U.S. Yeah, so I think the estimates are it account, yeah, so you can need a 20 percentage point change in that market share that's attributed to Vietnam. So a lot of the new export activity, that replacement is going to Vietnam. So as I said, this became a huge policy debate even well before the Liberation Day Trump administration. There were you can see there's a lot of newspaper articles talking about this. Is Vietnam moving product through Vietnam, or is China moving product through Vietnam as a way of avoiding the Trump tariffs? And there were accusations, there were some investigations. So solar panels, steel, wood cabinets. There have been some accusations of counterfeit local content certificates. Right here is the thing that really started to concern us, which is this type of discussion online. So look, the argument sort of went, look, Vietnam's trade deficit with China is increasing. Its trade surplus with the US increasing. This is all rerouting. And people were calling all of that activity rerouting. And so what we wanted to do was pick this apart and talk more specifically, as I will in a second, about what these increases actually meant. And I think we have a bunch of trade economists online. Obvious note is that already supply chains have been shifting into Vietnam long before the 2018 tariffs. Second, it would make complete sense that those supply chains were buying imports from China. And third, Vietnam is growing over this period, and so it's importing more from China just in terms of household goods while companies are starting to export. So there's a whole bunch of trends that are going on that are all being conflated as part of this trade surplus. So we thought that working with aggregate data is probably not the best way to handle this. And finally, I should say, so like when this paper was just a twinkle in our eyes, not even an actual paper, we actually got subpoenaed to actually discuss our findings in by country of origin from the what's called the Vietnam Enterprise Census. Some people call it the Vietnam Enterprise Survey. Firms are obligated in Vietnam to fill this out, so it usually captures the vast majority of firms, especially those above 10 employees. I know Ings Online and Brian have worked with this data before. And so we code by the country of the origin, the largest capital owner in the country or equity owner in the company. So what you can see here very clearly is there is a post 2018 surge in investment. We see increases in a lot of countries afterwards. So famously, the the US, you see as Apple moves its supply chain into Vietnam. But by far, the largest amount of activity here, this large change in slope, is Chinese firms moving into Vietnam. And I could show this in two different ways. These are not small companies. I think sometimes people think these are small companies, but I could show you here's the number of operations. But China also becomes one of the largest foreign employers in Vietnam over this time, with an average factory size that's in the hundreds, and in some of these factories are have thousands of employees. And then you see a slight increase and then a flattening out of Korean activity. So these investments are increasing in Vietnam. You see this large surge moving in Korea. Actually, they're not necessarily moving from China. These are FDI. A lot of this FDI is coming from Korea, but these most of these investment is investment moving in from China. Okay, and over the same period, we do see an increase um, in both Vietnamese exports to the US and imports from China over this period. Like it's a 4.5 fold increase in exports to the US. China's share of Vietnam's imports increased by 5.5 percentage points. And there's arguments for why this activities would take place in the literature. Vietnam has historically strong ties with China. There's geographic continuity, there's cultural proximity. All of these have to do with why you would see this increase in investment. All right, I just want to give a little bit on supply chains just to understand how we're thinking about it. And I know a lot of people know this already, but so um, prior to 2018, one of the dominant strategies for multinational corporations that were working in Vietnam was called a China plus one strategy. And in the China plus one strategy, you sourced your raw materials from a third country, and then you did your processing or manufacturing in China mostly, and then exported to Western markets. But a lot of countries, as wage rates went up in China, as there were certain supply chain, issues that were being noticed, as people felt too dependent on China, you saw other companies start to open up what I think of as an insurance contract. So another operation and it didn't have to be Vietnam. You saw this in Bangladesh and India and Indonesia, but another location in Vietnam that also sourced raw materials, that did processing and assembly, and then exported to Western markets. And that insurance contract was available, say, in 2018. So in 2018, the first set of activity you saw that led to this trade increase was expansions in existing facilities in Vietnam. So existing facilities, and then maybe expanding existing facilities a little bit. But after a little while, you started to see something separate, which people call a China through one strategy. And in the China through one strategy, you're still sourcing raw materials. There's still some processing that's taking place in China, but then there's additional manufacturing and additional assembly that's taking place in these third countries before export to the US. So you're moving actually a portion of the supply chain. And that's when you're seeing that increasing investment of Chinese investment moving into Vietnam. That's really what it's about. So they're actually creating new factories there and are doing some of the assembly for that, and coming to Western markets. How much of this is real production and how much of this is just sticking a made in Vietnam sticker on it? Okay, so we put together this little table just to get our head around what's going on. So let me start at the bottom here. There's a set of activities that are what we call value-added activities, which is they're sourcing raw materials or intermediate goods from China and then exporting to the US. And there's a number of different groups that can do this. Vietnamese domestically owned companies, private or state companies, existing foreign companies, new domestic companies that open up, and then new foreign-owned companies that are doing this China through one strategy. And then all of those same actors can engage in rerouting. They can all do the same thing of just basically taking the goods, relabeling them, and sending them on. Okay, so what we're going to try and do we do in this paper is three things. So first of all, we want to actually propose a new measure of rerouting to rerouting. The first is to look at this aggregate level, which I've already told you I can be a little bit confusing because it tends to conflate um, a large number of production activities. A second is to just simply look at correlations of imports and exports. What we want to do here is something that's different. What we want to do is actually do this on the product level. And so we have access to some great data that's pretty exciting, which is from Panjiva, we got Vietnam's bill of lading data. So this is the actual shipments on at customs that are listed on ship manifests. And it's great because they're listed at the 8-digit level. They say where the product was imported from and where it's going. So it has both of that information. It has the value of the product. It has the number of pieces, 8-digit code. And then one piece of it that's really amazing is that it has the tax code. So we can match the shipments to the existing firms in Vietnam using the tax code. Um, we match that. That's at the 8-digit, the HS 8-digit level. We match that with the tariff digit, which is listed at the 6-digit level. Um, and then finally, we match that with the Vietnamese enterprise survey. And here we have ownership, employment. And the nice thing about that data is that way we can look to see, well, are companies that we think that are doing rerouting, did they actually engage in more investment? Did they actually hire new workers? We can actually see whether their activity comports either with the value added type of investment or the rerouting. Okay. Um, so just to give you a sense of the tariffs, this is why um, so we're focusing on US tariffs exposed exclusively on Chinese imports, and we're looking at the 8-digit level. This is what I wanted to say. By 2019, we're talking about 91% of exported products and 90% of imported products. There's just not enough untariffed products to use as the counterfactual. I just want to be super clear about that. So we're going to try and get at this in other ways, but there's just it would be really nice if the tariffs were introduced randomly on products, but they weren't. Okay, so the first thing I want to highlight is our measurement. So the way to think about this measurement is we want to start off at the simplest level, which is to say the same firm imported the same 8-digit product that it exported. All right, that would be our example of rerouting. And we're gonna, if we observe that, we're gonna call that rerouting. Um, now, um, the you can look at this at the firm level, but when we started into this project, a lot of people said this might not be the way that rerouting is actually taking place. It might be taking place through networks of businesses that are co-locating in order to do this. That would be two different companies, one company doing the importing, passing it on to another company and doing the exporting. And in some of the cases that we looked at, such as the case on Chinese-made cabinets, that was found guilty of rerouting by the U.S. Trade Authority. In that case, that is exactly what happened. So we come up with another measure where we say, is it a province exported, imported to that province and then exported to that province? And we can, of course, also look at it on the national level. And so we define rerouting as this minimum of exports to the U.S. versus minimum imports from China over exports to the U.S. So and most of the time what we observe is this sort of share of imports over exports that we observe as the measure of rerouting. Okay. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, and I just want to, like, so you can, here you can see here that we're indexing by provinces and then the quarter of the trade, and then the product. So K stands for province, P for product, T for quarter. But we can aggregate also just to the week to the firm level, so replace that with a P, or we can aggregate it at the full national level. Is our imports coming in the whole country or exports to the whole country? Um, so here, what you can see here is using that country level aggregation, we would observe about 15% rerouting in 2018, 18% in 2021, and a 3.1 percentage point change, about a 20.4% change in rerouting. At the province level, you can see it's about, a little bit over a third as much, 5.8% to 7.4%, 26.5% change in rerouting. And then the firm level, the specific firm importing the same product is much lower. So to kind of be conservative throughout the analysis, we focus on this provincial rerouting measure. We think it's the one that's the most accurate because it takes into account the network of firms. So you can see about, and that would be about 7.4% rerouting. Now, looking at over the quarters, because we're aggregating by quarter, so you can see here, looking at that provincial level rerouting measure, rerouting share of exports to the US, you see it's about 6%, gets up to 8% here afterwards. And then there's this large spike, 2020 to 2021. I don't think that's incidental. That kind of this is, I think it's not a coincidence that it kind of overlaps with the recovery of COVID from COVID activity. So, and that surge in exports that a lot of people think was Vietnam saving grace. And then evens out over here down to about 8%. So that's rerouting over time. All right. Everybody always wants to see this. So which products are being rerouted the most? So just to give you a sense of it. So here's like just a list of I think I think it might be the 20 or most rerouted products. Um, so I want to highlight a couple of things here. And we can probably present this a little bit rather than make you puzzle through these products, but um, one thing to notice is that most of these products are kind of capital intensive to produce, and I think there's reasons for that. There are ones that where labor is not cheap, and so to actually produce these. And so you wouldn't want to this wouldn't be one where it would be expensive to start new production in Vietnam, and you couldn't take advantage of Vietnam's low labor wages. A second thing is most of these products that you see with a lot of rerouting tend to be more business to business type of products, not necessarily business to consumer. And I think there's a reason for that because during this period, as you know, this loophole was just closed, but this is the period when there's a de minimis loophole in the US. And you see a lot of Chinese companies don't have to worry about the tariffs because they're exporting these small, like fast fashion or toys that are individually packaged and under the $800 limit. So these are the types of products you can see. And here's one where I just want to say, like, where we need to do some thinking. This integrated circuits we code as highly rerouted, but we've had some conversations with some economics officers from the US who've been talking to some of the integrated circuit producers in Vietnam, including Intel. And Intel was saying that we might be overestimating rerouting because while they're importing the circuits, they're also importing dies, expensive dies that they add to the circuits in Vietnam. And when they export those keep the same 8-digit code. So there might be an issue there. I don't know how many products that affects, but that's one where we might be overestimating that particular product. Okay. Just to do a little bit of validation test. So the first one is, just this, I think Jaya tends to call this sense making or sense test, and I think that makes the most sense. So, like a way of thinking about this is like, are our instincts here correct? So, we would expect that rerouters should be exporting non-rerouters because that's the entire goal of their operation. So U.S. exports should be higher per worker, and they should also have higher sales because that's the goal. And you can see here these are the coefficient estimates from rerouters. Compared to the ones that we're labeling as non-rerouters, they have higher levels of exports per worker because they're just sticking a Made in Vietnam sticker on it, and higher levels of revenue because they're higher levels of sales. Um, for the reasons that I explained before, they should have higher capital intensivity. And you can see here that as capital intensivity increases, the share of products that are rerouted also increase. And then finally, just another sense test here. They should be correlated. Rerouting should increase with the tariff on Chinese products. So you can see rerouting increases here. As tariffs go up, the share of products that are rerouted goes up. So that makes us feel good. That I think we think our measure is actually picking up this activity. One thing, this is just for a Vietnam audience, just a specialist Vietnam audience. Where is the rerouting taking place? So this is just, we've just sort of zeroed in on the provinces that have the most rerouting activity. One thing that I have found really intriguing is that there is a lot of rerouting. If you like, especially if you look at this increase over time, a lot of the rerouting is taking place along the Highway 5 and Highway 6. So that Highway 5 to Lao Cai and that Highway 6 from Hanoi to Haiphong. So it does seem that there's reasons why you want to be located around major transport zones. And then there seems to be other clustering of rerouting activity around some major ports, including around Haiphong, around Da Nang, and around Ho Chi Minh City, Ba Sia Vung Tau. Kind of, so that's kind of interesting. We haven't really figured out the best analysis for pulling that out yet, but that's kind of what we observe in the data. Okay, so the next question is, does rerouting respond to the trade war? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to compute the initial tariff increase for each product and then the source country pair where that import's coming from. And so here, what we're looking for is the identification is essentially coming from the source of the import. Is it Japan? Is it Taiwan? Is it the US? And we're comparing to imports from China. Then we estimate how rerouting moves around the first tariff. That C is indexing by source country. This is that initial tariff increase. And then this is the quarter of the initial tariff announcement. So, all right. So just to give you a picture, there's that tariff announcement. And then here's the quarter after. There's a few quarters we don't see very much increase in routing. And then we see this huge spike as we get several quarters after. We see a large um, so you can notice there isn't much of a pre-trend in routing. It's kind of none of these are actually significantly different. So we're not seeing a pre-trend in rerouting though. So it really just starts to pick up basically, like 3/4 of a year after the tariff announcement and increases thereafter. Um, yeah. So so here's our once again our country, our province, and our firm estimates, zeroing in on that province estimate. So province level rerouting for the average increase in tariffs. And so that change indicates a 20.5 increase in provincial rerouting since 2018. So there has been 20.5% increase. If we applied it to the 2025 tariffs, like if we were to re-estimate, that would be about a 25.7% increase in rerouting coming from the new tariffs. The next question that is really interesting is like, who's doing the rerouting? And here, this is the part that I find really, really interesting. So the first thing is the remember I was explaining like you had incumbent firms that also increased their exports by adding new shifts or by expanding their factory sizes. Those incumbent firms are not the ones that are responsible for the rerouting, that are actually coming into Vietnam and starting factories and starting up operations after the introduction of the tariffs. And and you can see that increases and diverges over time. So that's super interesting in that oh, Brian, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. It looks like I, as the host, can't access the Q&A. Otherwise, I would have posted this for your co-authors. But I'm just curious here, when you're thinking about an entrant, how are you coping with, like, in terms of tax codes, multiple tax code entities who might be part of the same overall investor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think um we have not yet done the hard work of, like, say for example, connecting all the Samsung companies. We're treating each tax code. Sungju, make sure we're treating each tax code as a separate company here. Yeah. And
Yes, yes.
when the tax code enters the data set. I Brian, I remember you were looking into this. Did you find a way to identify connected companies in the tax data?
So we did try to do a little bit about this using the Orbis data, and it didn't match very well with the Vietnamese data. But I know Devaki, Ahmed, and Daria seem to have something that they've been doing by name searching through the Panjiva data to try
Mhm.
to group them that way. But
Okay, that might be something we could do. Yeah. Yeah, I looked into this a little bit, but I even like some of the companies that I know that are Samsung affiliated don't have Samsung names. So I think it's a tough task to do. But so new tax codes is I guess the way we should call it, versus incumbent tax codes, to be clear. But I do think a lot of this doesn't is it appears to be increases, especially in Chinese investment. Um, yeah. So one little sort of another sort of test that we do here that kind of gets at the same question is to look at the like the share of rerouting, the share of exports from the company, that are rerouted. So at all over 10% or over 50%. And then one of the nice things too here to see is that the coefficients across these as decrease as the threshold that were the cutoff increases. So that also seems to suggest that this is driven more like so by newer firms that didn't that weren't engaging in pre-existing trade prior to it. Okay. Next question. Which countries are doing it? And so these are this for the individual countries, and you can see that it is the that largest diff and diff estimate at about 0.75 or point oh seven five is China. That has the largest impact. We see positive rerouting here from Taiwan and Hong Kong as well. You can see also that Vietnamese domestic companies are doing this. That stands to reason both in the steel case and in the cabinet case. It was Vietnamese companies that registered Vietnamese companies, not registered foreign companies, that were doing the export, but that happened to be in the same province as it. So one of the things that I've sort of taken from this is, or one sort of interpretation is that the there's overall there's not a very large increase in rerouting. It's about 8.8% of total exported activities. But for these new Chinese firms that enter after 2018, it's about 46% of them are engaged in rerouting. So it is kind of like, so you can say, like, there's sort of two ways to think about this. Like, on one level, you can say most of the exported activity from Vietnam to the US is not rerouting, but on the other hand, a large share of these Chinese firms are in fact engaged in it. And then here's just another way of thinking about it. So which were the products that were most affected by the tariffs to increase rerouting? So, and it's actually interestingly not the same products. So where this is, here we're organizing them by the coefficient estimate. So which particular products were most, in general, it's the same types of goods, capital intensive, but it's not exactly the same products, so that were most responsive, I guess. And I think part of that has to do with somewhere we were running before. Okay. Um, So now to move into the firm outcome. Um, so um, we want to see how rerouting relates to firm performance in Vietnam. So we observe firm outcomes annually because we have the enterprise census data, but our rerouting measure we can only reconstruct after January 2018. So we really can't do like a perfect diff and diff here. So we aggregate our data to the province industry year level, and then we run this equation where this Y is our different outcomes, including logged employment, logged capital, logged materials, and then we're indexing by provinces. And I think, as you guys know, Vietnam uses a four-digit ISIC code, and then the tariff year. So we're gonna look at that against both rerouting and then against tariffs. Okay. All right. So the key takeaway here is that you can see um, rerouting is associated with more employment, larger or more revenue, more employment, more capital, more material purchases, and higher profits. So than firms that engage in less rerouting. So, but um, they are using less labor as a share of revenue and less capital as a share of revenue and more materials as a share of revenue. So if you think about that a little bit, it makes a lot of sense. They are importing materials to engage in rerouting, so their material share is higher, but they're using less labor and less capital in the production. So we see overall bigger firms tend to be doing it, but these labor shares are sort of consistent with what we would expect from rerouting, which is lower utilization of labor and capital and more imports of raw materials. Also, yeah, profit margins tend to be a little lower. And then finally, we looked at, so here we're just looking at the rerouting share, but here we look at the overall tariff change. And the pattern looks very similar. The higher the tariff change, the larger increase in employment, increase in labor, capital, material, and profits. So yeah, to give you a sense, that top coefficient implies that for the average sample change in tariffs, about 14.5%, firm sales increased by 0.80 log points, about 123% change. Um, so fixed assets increased by 136%, and materials increased by 146%. But once again, when we look at those shares, a higher tariff increase is associated actually with actually reductions in labor share to 31% of the pre-treatment average. And then again, consistent with okay. So to sum up, and then we'll take some questions. So we're pretty excited about this paper. I think one of the reasons this paper is cited by everybody on all sides of this debate, American policymakers for and against tariffs, Vietnamese policymakers, is because we really do need right now more than ever a really precise way to measure this rerouting activity. I don't think there's any any debate that with the wide differences in tariff rates that were proposed on Liberation Day, or between the proposed 145% tariff on China and 10% on Vietnam, that we're going to see a huge shift in global supply chains, both for value added and rerouting activity. Um, so the bulk of overall activity is companies from Korea, Japan, the US, and even some from China and Taiwan moving value add activity into Vietnam. But there's no doubt, and that engaging in what we call a China through one strategy of buying raw materials and doing processing and doing assembly and manufacturing in Vietnam. But there very clearly is a set of Chinese firms that are engaging in exactly this type of rerouting activity that people have been concerned about. Um, Firms exposed to the tariffs grow faster, but they grow towards material intensive. Active policy is we're going to require precise tracking as rerouting is concentrated among new Chinese firms and does pose a risk for third parties. And just to get into this policy debate, I just wanted to raise a few points because this is a Vietnamese audience. This is what Trump said on Liberation Day, which obviously caught my eye as someone who studies Vietnam. Vietnam, great people, great negotiators. They like me, I like them. The problem is they charge us 90%. We're going to charge them a 46% tariff. I think the first thing that to note about that is I hope what you got from this table is that the reason Vietnam has such a large trade surplus with the US, which is why how the tariffs were determined, is specifically because of the original Trump tariffs in 2018, which drove that activity into the US. And then, as I said, the second thing to think about that they continue under this new system and it's really important, I think, in terms of how U.S. policymakers deal with this, is to have very precise measurement, which we think is possible, and we think we are pointing the way towards how to do that. And then finally, I just want it from the Vietnamese policy side. I'd want to raise this here because we have a lot of Vietnamese economists and some policymakers online. I just want to say, like, I'm very sympathetic to the Vietnamese position. This investment has fueled rapid Vietnamese growth. Some people have said this is the saving grace from COVID, was Vietnam was able to export it out of the COVID problems. So I do think in some ways this this has been beneficial, and as we show, even leading to some tax revenue and sales in Vietnam. But I think it's pretty clear that in terms of Vietnam's you know, ability to be able to stay in the good graces of the current administration, some effort to be able to disentangle and inspect and try and find a way to address the rerouting activities would go a long way for continuing the trade relationship with the US, which right now accounts for about 30% of Vietnam's exports. And then I'll just leave it at that. And Jay and Sungju, jump in here if you guys want to add anything or answer any of the questions.
Great, Eddie. Thank you very much. Finished like bang on time, so that's great. Well done. So yeah, now we do have a scheduled sort of 15 minutes for open Q&A. I'll leave it to Eddie to just maybe flag questions if people just want to put their hands up maybe, and we'll take it from there.
I'll just keep my slides up so I can just move really fast between them. Should I just call people, Brian, or do you want
Yeah,
to?
I think so. Yeah, I wanted to. I don't think I need to sort of be the.
Okay, Andre.
Hi, Evan. Thanks a lot. Super interesting project and nice presentation. I was wondering about this. So the thing that, and apologies if I missed something in between. It was a little, I didn't quite get everything. But there was this. So the thing that stick to my mind was this part about the incumbent and the existing firms, right? So I really would like to know more about this how they compare. Maybe I don't know whether you have some descriptive statistics as such, just because, of course, I mean, it raises the question about how comparable are the two, right? If something is really just set up in order to do the job for the rerouting, right, then probably comparing it to the organic firm that has been doing business over the years, right, and has had other purposes is probably could potentially be significantly different, right, in terms of characteristics. So I'm just worrying about this a little bit, but I mean, I understand that part of what Brian said earlier, right, is kind of geared to that in terms of can you match them with their mother firms, or can you figure out which are the conglomerates, and can you take into account the data and other the data broadly speaking from their parent companies or so, right?
Yeah. So just to sort of zero in on that, I think what you're asking is like, is it really the newness of the firm, or is it other features associated with new firms that are doing the work here? Is that the?
I think that's a fair description, yes.
Yeah, and like we can do some things like controlling for some features of the firms in the data set. Like we can control for size and we can control for the specific sector that the firm's in, which we do a little bit. But you're right. We don't necessarily have an identification strategy. And I don't think, Jay and Sungju, have we tried to look at balance on covariates between new and incumbents when we did this analysis?
So I think so please correct me, Jai Ibehi, if I said this wrong, but I think here what we are doing is more like a decomposition
Hmm.
exercise. So the way we define this measure is we have the minimum of import and export, and then we interact this with an indicator of firm characteristics.
Hmm.
So all these coefficients that you are seeing here, the red dot and blue dot, if you sum them up, they will equal to the coefficient that you are seeing in the previous slide. So here, I think we are showing that, okay, what's the percentage of that rerouting that you're seeing in each period that's coming from new entrants versus incumbents? Yeah, so it's a decomposition exercise.
Yeah. So just to kind of double click on that a little, and just so you can hear, the control group remains the same. So the key to our identification strategy is that we're really comparing imports from China to imports from other source countries relative to the exports to the US. And I think one thing that's useful here is that even if it would have to be the case that, so I guess an underlying implicit assumption is that both new entrants and incumbents for the same product kind of have the same kind of underlying production. There's some kind of standard underlying production structure for whatever product you're exporting. So to the extent that we're looking at literally the same HS8 product, like Eddie mentioned, like the Intel example with the semiconductors, it would have to be the case that like new entrants are more likely to be importing the same HS8 product that's an input to produce the same HS8 product. So like new entrants are more likely to be importing dies for semiconductors from China relative to importing them from anywhere else, relative to like incumbents to really be driving this. And so to the extent that new entrants and incumbents should have similar production functions for the same product or the same level of intra-industry trade, then I think it's fair to use the same kind of identification strategy. And here we're just doing a decomposition of kind of our benchmark findings, but trying to see how much of it is coming from different types of firms with different characteristics, if that makes sense. But it is a good point that like if we were to do like a firm specific analysis where we're using different firms as the control group rather than doing this product level decomposition, we would want to be careful about the characteristics of the firms that
Yeah.
we're including in the regression.
Sorry. All right. Kian?
Hi. Hi. Thank you for the presentation. It's been instructing, and yes, and I was an audience of Sangyo on the paper for like professor sitting and making this amazing work. I have a question on the can you like see the table of the product, your affected product?
Do you want to see there's two tables of products. Do you want to see the ones that were,
The early one, yes.
yeah.
So yes, yeah. So for this table. So I'm wondering that in this list product, there might be some. So you say that the rerouting happened when the product came into Vietnam in one province in one quarter, and then also come to the US in that part. But like so. If what if in some of these list of products, what if some product that are just happen to be manufacturing or some with some very light work on that, and within just one quarter, like
Yeah.
I mean the production work it just happened in one quarter, so it's not exactly rerouting, but it just because of that is very quick.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good question. I guess the way, I'd rephrase your question is just to say, like, are we being overly stringent in our definition of rerouting by
Yes.
saying, but
Yes.
like, yeah, that maybe there is some activity that's taking place that might lead to a product change that isn't really very difficult to do, right? And that
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
easy to handle.
And
Yeah.
also, I think that
I,
might
mhm.
coincide with, like technology advance some
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
That's
think it's a good point. Yeah, no, I mean, we chose this strict definition, because, because we were trying to stay like in line with the way economists were thinking about this, but also what was legal and what's not legal, right? So like, if new content is being added in Vietnam and that can be justifiably receive a certificate of origin, then we didn't consider that to be rerouting. But you're right, there might be activity that there might and so from a legal basis it might be fine, but what you're saying is the spirit of the law might still be violated here. What like Sungju and you, I just asked my co-authors if they have some thoughts on this. Yeah.
cool. Perhaps, I mean, like, my question is perhaps like the proportion of it. I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah, if that is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're absolutely right in what you're
Yeah.
asking. Yeah. Jaya, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely an art. I think the big picture response is that there's definitely an art and sort of there's trade-offs in how stringently we want to define our rerouting measure in every dimension. And I think you're raising, I think the product code dimension is one big one. I think the geographic dimension is another one. In some sense, as researchers, one approach we do take in the paper is we just say, we'll compute the numbers using all of these different parameter decisions, and we'll show you which ones matter quite a lot and which ones don't. And I think depending on the application, different definitions of rerouting might make sense. For the goals of our project, which are to try and capture in the big picture, you know, the sort of body of rerouting, I think that we make an argument for the choices we've made. But I completely agree that, there's going to be type 1 and type 2 errors in both directions. So I think in that case, the sort of implication of our paper is that one really good thing about this approach is that depending on the application, different researchers, different policymakers, they can make their own choices that are most suitable for their situation. I don't know if I think it's related to what you were asking.
Yeah. And so we did in the paper, we do calculate rerouting by different levels of product aggregation as well. I didn't show you that before, but you can see that here at the 4-digit. Like, let's say we were not as stringent and we allowed 6-digit, or we allowed aggregation to the 4-digit, which in your case, that would say, like, so for example, okay, rerouting's taking place and it's changing at the 8-digit level, but the 6-digit code would still be the same. This table would capture it, right? And so then you would see that, yeah, and in fact, but there's actually not too much difference between 8 digits and 6-digit. If we get really, really, like, broad to the 4-digit level, then you might actually see some differences in numbers here.
Thank you.
Yeah. I
Okay. Hi, Andy. So I just have a quick clarifying questions that basically the 8-digit rerouting you guys have starting from 2018. So therefore you cannot calculate the rerouting measure before 2018.
Yeah.
And therefore your like when you calculate that, when you all of the table you show us about the rerouting diff and diff, I guess how many pre-period do you have?
We have 4 periods and then the announcement period.
And then the other thing I wanted to add is that the tariffs were levied in a sequence. So some of them were levied early on in like mid to late 2018. So for those particular changes, we'll have shorter pre-periods, but other tariffs were added later on, and we're also leveraging that variation. So the reason that we actually have 3 and more quarters in some cases, is that we're using those 2019 additional tariffs.
Okay, so that this figure, particular figure, you kind of throw out the July 2018 announcement. Is that right?
So we are using those. You can think of, so if you look from the left-hand side, the first two coefficients will not be able to use the first wave of tariffs because in the July 2018, we only have 2 quarters before. But in the 2019 tariffs, we have, up to 4 or more quarters before. So in a sense, the first few coefficients, they're using slightly different sets of products. The more detailed way of answering your question is, July of 2018, we see 2 quarters before, and then in the tariffs implemented after, we see more and more quarters.
So this is not a balance. It's not a
Correct.
balance.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Exactly.
And we do a robustness. We have a set of robustness checks in our paper where we just have a fixed kind of treatment start date of July 2018, so Q3 2018. And so we restricted just 2-3 periods, and then everything kind of follows through. It's both qualitatively and quantitatively quite similar. So
Right. Thank you.
Niam?
Hi, it's a great project. I have, so this is the questions that perhaps not really could be answered with this approach. But one thing that I think about when you think about the effectiveness of this policy from the American perspective is how this policy could have increased prices or welfare, or how it's changed the welfare of American people, right? From American perspective, you shouldn't care at all about how Vietnam benefits anything from the changes of the tariffs. So the question that you're trying to answer here is how effective the tariffs at destroying China, and the answer is not really good. But the perhaps you could do some kind of back of the envelope calculation, not like a full quantitative trade, but you are saying basically 2 things. One is that this trade model is like lacking this rerouting. That's one. Second is that even with some back of the envelope, we could calculate how the welfare of Americans could have changed had there was no rerouting. And in that sense, then American politicians or policymakers could be like, wow, rerouting is, it's kind of not effective as a tariff policy, but it's also help Americans not decline in welfare so much. And so there's kind of a gain from this. And also there's a value added things that you argue that, South Korean firms also sell more to the US and so on. So in a way, Americans kind of benefit from rerouting in some way, right? And so I think that would be a very cool angle to think about the Americans, or to engage with American policymakers.
I think it's a great question. And one thing that I've been puzzling over is, so there's been a lot of estimates of the tariff pass-through from 2018. And those estimates have been really high, like 95%. So if rerouting is taking place and it's so sizable, why is the pass-through from the tariffs to the US consumer so high? Wouldn't we have expected that the prices would have stayed low? Because of this substitution effect. I'm not a trade economist. So I'm watching my trade economist cringe as my co-authors cringe as I talk, but I'm really interested in that question. So I totally agree. I do think the other question was, we were interested from the Vietnamese welfare point of view, but you're right. In some ways, you can think of this as kind of a lever that allows Donald Trump to bash China while still not imposing too much of a cost on American consumers. And that by trying to go after rerouting all over the world, that in fact, you get the bash China effect, but then you don't get the alleviation that happened. Abehi, do you want to set me straight here?
Yeah.
I don't know if Abehi's connection
I
is
think,
good.
and I think
Oh, sorry,
this,
she's back.
but yeah, I think that's a great news that, well, can you actually hear me?
Yes, now we can.
I don't know if the connection is good. Okay. Well, it is tricky in the sense that yes. So the issue is what's the counterfactual, right? Relative to a world in which there are no tariff increases on China, welfare is lower, right? Adult welfare is reduced because there's this kind of extra step that goods have to take, and because of the triangle inequality, right? Like the reason these goods were going directly from China in the first place rather than through Vietnam was because trade costs were lower. And so rerouting is definitely increasing prices relative to what they would have been in the counterfactual world without tariffs. But then because tariffs are distortionary, yes, rerouting is reducing some of the distortionary effect of tariffs. And so obviously higher rerouting, potentially, although it depends again on how you factor in like the lost tariff revenues and how you want to account for how tariff revenues are redistributed and allocated and all of that stuff. But yeah, I think that's a great kind of suggestion and something to point out. I will say, I guess the more negative take on this is that if the policymaker, right, is from the perspective of a policymaker who's like, we're willing to incur some welfare cost on the American consumer or like on the American economy overall in order to achieve a political goal or a policy goal of decoupling from China, and rerouting actually reduces the effectiveness of that, then that's a negative, right? In the sense that like you're actually not hurting China as much as you think you were, but you're still incurring the cost of the tariff. So it is. But it is interesting. And Eddie, you're not, don't worry, I wasn't cringing too much.
Can I chime in also? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
I think this is a fascinating question. So I think to summarize the main point, which I completely agree with, there is a direct trade-off between two American policy goals. One, which is to cut back purchases from China, and two, to protect the US consumer. So that's just a pure trade-off in the situation. It's going to be bad for prices to cut back on trade from China. How bad is an open question. I think what our work does with the pre-existing work, where they find a lot of price pass-through of the tariffs, is that we show rerouting relative to what had been bandied about on Twitter and by journalists and even by some policymakers, is that if you really get a good measure of rerouting, it looks a lot lower than aggregate measures. And that's why there might be a lot of pass through, because the ability to adapt is smaller than we thought. And then, yeah, so I think that oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I can stop there.
Okay,
I don't.
maybe I'll jump in real quick because I'm cognizant of Eddie and the co-author team's time, because we are a little bit over. But if you're happy to still take questions, I'm happy to like keep the meeting open. I know I have a number of questions, but I could also just send them to you over email afterwards. So, how are you time-wise?
I could do another like 10 minutes, but I have another appointment that I've got to run to.
Are there any other questions from the floor? If not, I will take advantage of speaking.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I was curious about the example you gave about if I have the product name right, the integrated circuits, right? And you said that, there did seem to be some evidence, like from your meetings, that there was value added happening there. Have you looked then at the 8-digit product codes that you're sort of associating with rerouting to see how often you see sort of changes in the unit value compared to the imports versus the exports, to sort of get a sense of if there is any processing, I know there's gonna be like storage and transportation costs, but if you see ones for which the unit value of exports has increased some arbitrary threshold, I don't know what it is, but maybe that might be more indicative of some local value added going into that product.
We just learned about this issue last week, so we haven't really been able to respond to it, but that's a great idea, actually. Behi, what do you think? Can we do that with our data?
Subject to some caveats, yes. We have as reported quantities. We've been going back and forth. We don't have like nice standardized unit values because we don't have weights. We have as reported quantities. But then I was talking with Meredith Crowley about actually using as reported quantities versus weights, and it's doable with some caveats. Yeah.
And then a second, just minor question about the bill of lading data. How much does it cover relative to Vietnam's total exports to the US? Because it seems like it kind of varies from country to country, year to year in terms of the coverage rate.
Roughly about 65 to 80%. The coverage does get better over time. But comparing to Comtrade, yeah, about 65 to 80% of the value. And that's after we've done cleaning, because we also want to exclude, weird observations and all that. Yeah.
But what Abehi's worked with a number of countries with the Panjiva data, and she was saying that Vietnam is one of the countries that is the best organized and useful data, actually. So
Yeah, the tax codes, the tax ID saved us a lot of time on the merge. A lot of time.
Okay, well, I don't see any other hands up for questions from the floor, so maybe I'll take advantage of this pause to just thank Eddie and his co-authors for joining us today. It was I was very curious to see this paper. I'm very happy to get the chance to see it, and also just like to thank everyone else who showed up for our first attempt here at this online seminar series. I am hoping to try to make it an ongoing monthly thing, subject to my time constraints and subject to other people's sort of ongoing interest. So please keep an eye out if you haven't had a chance to sign up already for the email list to get your name on there so that we can keep you posted about oncoming seminars. My goal is to try to have it as sort of like a mix of, sort of established versus more junior researchers, to sort of, introduce many people who I've been in touch with, probably many of you others have been in touch with, but in case you haven't, try to sort of, build a bit of an online networking community here for people who are interested in academic research on Vietnam. So thank you again for everyone who came, and thank you, Eddie and team, once again. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for letting us do this and get a chance to share. And thank you for putting this group together. Hey, can I ask one favor? Can you transfer the host responsibilities to me so I can debrief with my co-authors so they can tell me everything I got wrong for a second?
Yeah, there you go. You should be host now. So, okay. All right.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Eddie.
Hey,
Nice to see
Brian.
you
Thank
again.
you. Yeah, let's connect later. Yeah, that
Sounds good.
thank you for letting us do this. This was awesome.
Oh, my pleasure. It really was a good excuse because I've seen your paper for a while, and this was a good chance to really get to actually see the details of it a little bit. So,
Hey, can we ask you a question? I have a question for you about before you leave. I know you're busy. You've published a lot of papers like this that have a trade component but are mostly empirical. How did you handle like the publication strategy for that? Like, did you feel like you needed a trade model to appeal to the
yeah, so we have had problems with that, I would say. And it feels like that's getting to be a more common barrier in more recent years compared to earlier.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think part of the strategy that we've used is just trying to look for journals where we think we would have a higher likelihood of drawing editor who's sympathetic to reduce form empirical work, right? Like carefully done without necessitating a model. But almost every time we do get comments from referees saying like, oh yeah, it would be nice if you then, put this in models so you can do various counterfactuals. My guess is that for your paper, that's maybe a little bit less of an issue, right? Because like, I'm trying to think of like what the obvious counterfactual would be that like a referee or editor might start asking about. And it might be something like, okay, well, suppose Chinese firms were banned from investing in Vietnam, right? Something like that, like there's some sort of like foreign direct investment constraint such that basically shuts down Chinese firms from being able to reroute through Vietnam. Well, I think your results would basically say, well, that shuts down the vast majority of rerouting, right? So, would you expect other firms coming out of Hong Kong or Taiwan to pick it up? I don't know, probably not that much, right? Because I think there's a lot of embedded technology that's coming with those firms in terms of their existing networks and production processes, right? So that popped into my mind in terms of like, what one might think about as a counterfactual here. But it seems like less of a constraint, and I think in this paper in some sense, because it's such a clear empirical question that you're trying to sort of get at some sense of like, just how common is this, right? Is sort of, it's a first order question. So that to me seems like hopefully you're probably a little bit more in the clear relative to maybe some other papers.
Okay, That's helpful. Maybe we should even say that. Like that might something we could just say directly, which is like the counterfactual, is pretty obvious and easy to deal with without a model. I mean,
Yeah, and I'm just, maybe avoid the JIE, maybe. I don't know. I don't know.
Now that's good advice.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm assuming you guys are going to be aiming higher than that anyways, and you should be. But so, yeah.
Right.
Where would you go? And it's nice to meet you, Brian. I'm a big fan.
Oh, thanks. That's very
Same
flattering.
and same, actually.
Yeah, hello, Brian.
Sungju, sorry, I'm just double checking. You just want to make sure I'm not mistaking the wrong person. You just recently finished at Duke, right? Your PhD, is that?
Yes, I graduated last year,
Mhm.
and
Okay.
I also want to thank you for the help that I've been consulting you on the VES data since PhD. So yeah,
Yeah, okay. Just want to make sure
happy
I
to
had
meet
the
you.
right name.
Yeah.
Where would I go? I mean, I think I would try one of the top 5 first, depending on how like time constrained people feel, because I think this is a super important question to get at relative to the overall reallocation that people are talking about, right? That would be one of my, and then I guess I would want to sort of take a look through the editors list, but I think I would definitely give it a shot at first. And then after that, I'm trying to think, so we right now have a paper at Restat being handled by Daniel Zhu, but he is done there. And I'm not sure who stepped in as the trade editor after he left. I think maybe Tribalin, who's definitely more spatial oriented, right? So, off the top of his, like I think Trev is pretty open to other stuff, but he definitely is a very structural trade spatial person, right? So it wouldn't be right up his alley. But so yeah, so then I think I'd have to sort of like look around. Like there's not a lot of people on the JE editorial board right now who are reduced form people, which isn't to say that you can't get, like good review and referee reports, right? But I think it just on the margin maybe shifts who is their knowledge base of who to send these things to, right? So yeah, I think after that I would maybe take a look to see, who's at EJ, who might be a good handler, AJ policy, see who might be a good handler there. And yeah, because I mean, this also seems like Eddie, I think like relative to some of our papers, we've often sort of pitched as kind of like overlapping between trade and development, because we've been looking at, like informality or employment levels, and
Yeah.
Whereas this seems like it's just, it's going to be a 100% trade paper in terms of who the editor would likely be in the referees, right? So that might, if you're looking at the journals, might make it a little bit easier to see who would be the most likely handler.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So we need
but if you're, if you're looking at, once you've sort of like made some targets, if you want to just run them by me, I'd be happy to give any thoughts that I might have of specific editors at different journals. But
that's
That's
super
so
helpful.
generous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
super.
really kind.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, it feels largely like it's kind of a bit of a guessing game at the end, right? But
Yeah.
you try your best. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
all right. Thanks again.
All right. Take care.
Super interesting.
All right. Take
Thank
it.
you, Brian.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you
Yeah.
so much.
Oh, we lost Jaya.
Oh, Jaya, come back. Wait, let me just send her a note.
What did you guys think? What did I get wrong?
Eddie, you did great. It's just the internet was a bit unstable during the talk.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so we lost you for stretches at a time.
I didn't even notice I got lost. Okay. All right. Yeah. Oh.
But overall, I think it was very clear, and I think people get the idea. Yeah,
Oh.
very clearly.
And then I did mischaracterize the incumbency. I should have said it was a decomposition. So okay.
No, I also get those questions when I present last week. So
Okay. All right. And then I like the pass-through question. I really do. I find it really intriguing. I get all the problems with it, but it's such an interesting question, especially given the shares that Alfaro and Chor are pointing out. Like when you're looking at, like when you look at that first graph that we show with all the countries and how much they're accounting for of Chinese trade, you sort of wonder, there should have been some effect or of lowering the pass-through. I mean, we don't know what the true pass-through would have been without it, but it's, you know, you would have imagined that it must be less than it would have been otherwise, but
Yeah.
unless like Abehi, do you think that the rerouters just choose to price slightly below what the tariff price would be, and that's why they can so in some sense they can increase their profits by allowing most of the pass through to happen.
Um, so the question of what their pricing would be does differ. Like it's not clear.
Mhm.
Because on the one hand, if it's like a Chinese, for example, like the Chinese, it's essentially like there was a Chinese entity that was selling to the US. So there's that firm to firm relationship. And they were sufficiently like elastic, right? So like the
Mhm.
US supplier was US buyer was sufficiently elastic such that part of the reason why this rerouting is happening is that the Chinese firm doesn't want to lose this existing relationship. And so they're
Mhm.
setting up an entity to send stuff through Vietnam. Then it would be less of it's more of like maintaining relationship than like increasing profits, right? So the question is whether it's like relationship maintenance between like an existing Chinese entity, like basically trying to ensure a link remains, versus the other mental model could be something like opportunistic, right? So I'm just like, I see that there's this arbitrage opportunity that exists. So I set up shop in Vietnam to do it. And,
Mhm.
but given our results, it probably seems more like I'm curious if we should ever go down this rabbit hole, but like it does seem more like the former, right? Like the fact that it's Chinese subsidiaries like setting up shop, it does seem more consistent with the idea that these were Chinese firms doing direct trade that are still trying to maintain that direct link
Yeah.
with their previous customers. And so in that sense, it would be, it would be you would only do that because like you weren't able to, like that's a link that would have disappeared if you
Yeah.
had tried to just do direct trade passing on the tariffs, right?
Yeah.
And so it's likely that they wouldn't be pricing up to the tariff increase. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally makes sense. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. 'Cause we were promising it you at this price, and now we're still getting it to you at this price. And so, right, like so, and so the chaos didn't get in the way. We can continue. You can continue to sell board games in the U.S. It makes complete sense. Um, so I think the things like so everybody wants the value added. Right, like
Yeah.
we still, yeah, and then you were saying that you had some ideas about, well, we can debrief about this tomorrow, but some ideas about how to better characterize the products rather than just giving them a list, but to provide some guidance on how.
Yeah. So yeah, I was thinking basically it would be like we would just merge with the BEC
Mhm.
at the BEC classification of goods as like intermediate versus final
Yeah,
consumer versus raw. And then I think it would stand out pretty clear that this is like most of these are intermediate inputs, but based on the BEC classification. So it's just kind of there.
I love
Um,
it. Yeah, I love
I
it.
actually work with the BEC code for my job market paper as
mhm.
well. Yeah, so that's definitely a clear way to classify whether the products are final versus intermediate. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anything else, or do you want to save it for tomorrow? I guess we're.
Yeah, was
Uh,
there anything immediate? Sorry, it was so funny. Eddie, if did people ask you questions during? I was literally sitting in a conference session and also listening to this at the same time, so it was a bit of multitasking. But were there any other questions that I feel like
There
I'm being a
was
bad conference participant, but
there weren't any challenging
um,
questions, I didn't think.
okay.
Yeah, there weren't any challenging ones. There was just, yeah, mostly kind of curiosity. And I take the point. There was this question about stringency of our characterization, but I think we have a way to handle that. answers. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for participating. I think, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie.
Talk
Thanks for
tomorrow.
presenting. Yep.
All right. Bye.
Okay. See you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.